there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas, it's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily Now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. Last year, an interesting show with a historian, Michael Scott Bauman, who wrote a book called The Shortest History of Israel and Palestine. It was written last year or the year before, so I'm sure it will have, in the updated version, a couple of new chapters. It was part of a series called The Shortest Histories, an intriguing series. There is the shortest history of China, of democracy, of England, of eugenics, of Europe, of France, of Germany, of Greece, of India, of Italy, of Japan, of war, and then the final two, most intriguingly entitled, The Shortest History of Our Universe and The Shortest History of Sex. And as it happens, they're both written by our guest today, David Baker, whose latest shortest history is The Shortest History of Sex. David is joining us from Queensland in Australia. David, you're an expert in short histories. How did you acquire that skill?
My specialty is called big history. It's an academic genre that mixes the sciences and humanities and looks at broad trends over the course of deep time. So one of the things that I constantly dealt with over my career was the rise of complexity over 13.8 billion years from the Big Bang to modern day, from subatomic particles to organisms to complex interwoven human societies. And pretty much the same for the history of sex over 2 billion years, looking at the long-term trends of how it evolved and changed, both biologically and then eventually culturally.
I'm going to try not to, David, make any jokes about long and short histories when it comes to sex, but what about the history of the universe? I guess after writing The Shortest History of the Universe, or Our Universe, the shortest history of sex must have been quite easy, wasn't it?
It's funny, the shortest history of the universe came out shorter than the history of sex. The thing is, once you have a full picture of things, some fairly straightforward phenomena can be explained quite easily. For instance, a lot of cosmology, at first blush, seems quite complex, but the dynamics and variables involved of, say, an asteroid hitting the Earth are very few compared to, say, the dynamics and variables and different outcomes of, say, international diplomacy or modern war, or anything really related to do with human behavior. Sex, of course, involves complex organisms right from the start, and then tails off into a vast web where nature meets nurture in terms of our biological instincts and our cultural practices and how those two interplay with each other. But yeah, I've been doing big history for nearly 2 decades. And it's this broad picture view. Used to teach it at a couple of universities back in the day, and so it was an easy fit to produce a couple of short histories that nevertheless had broad scope.
Well, speaking of easy fits, you talked about this book at first blush. Has sex always, for at least our species, has it always been rather embarrassing? Has it always been the kind of thing we blush about? When we look at other animals having sex, it doesn't seem as if it's quite as complicated as it is for us humans, or am I just imagining?
Well, it's certainly more complicated for humans. To address the first part of your question, and really how much we blush seems to depend more on culture than on instinct. So there are more, say, shall we say, sexually liberated cultures than others. and where more things are more permissive in other cultures than some others. However, there's always a line in any kind of culture. It certainly isn't a free for all in any sense, particularly if you look at any traditional culture that existed prior to 200 years ago. In terms of complexity, it is that element of culture that sort of puts things in to a greater degree, on a greater level of messiness that can have some surprising impacts on otherwise rational human behavior.
I remember that Buñuel film, The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie, where a group of very middle-class people had dinner while they were on the toilet. That's also, I guess, a form of appetite, one way or the other, eating, defecating. Why are we less ashamed about certainly eating? We do that publicly, socially. No one seems to be ashamed of that, as opposed to going to the bathroom or having sex.
Well, I mean, if you want to start with the instinctual, both defecation and copulation have an instinctual need for some privacy. Defecation is unhygienic, so many mammalian species tend to not shit where they eat. You might even observe other mammalian species being somewhat sheepish when they're in the process of that. And copulation, particularly when it comes to humans, when we started pair bonding, we didn't become a fully monogamous species. It's what I'd like to call an imperfect monogamy about 2 million years ago. But when we started pair bonding, a certain element of privacy was actually required. And it's illustrated by the sort of slow evolution of female vocalizations during orgasm. If you go back to, say, chimps and bonobos, with whom we have a common ancestor that's goes back 6 to 8 million years ago, female vocalizations during sex had a lot more to do with advertising who they were having sex with in the primate hierarchy. So if it was a higher ranking chimpanzee male, they tend to vocalize much, much more. If it's a low, say the lowest of the low in the male rankings, they tend not to vocalize at all. Whereas female vocalization since over the many millions of years seems to have become repurposed toward just one aspect of pair bonding during sex, which facilitates relationships and monogamy. So privacy is another one of those. If you are a chimpanzee, there's really no detriment to rutting out in the open. Whereas if you're trying to build a more intimate relationship with plenty of powerful emotions involved, yeah, having onlookers isn't necessarily a good thing. Now, all of that is increased by culture, because if you start with Homo sapiens and developing a polite society, never mind defecating in front of an audience, which is going to evoke a natural revulsion, a disgust response in other people. But it's also rather impolite, as would be, spitting in the street. Plenty of cultures would have taboos against something as simple as that. Certainly less disgusting than defecation. And the same goes with different cultural attitudes towards sex. Certain cultures might normalize, say, orgies to a certain extent, but that is very different from just having sex in the middle of the street.
Or in a restaurant. You remember, I know you referred to it in one of your tweets, that famous scene in When Harry Met Sally, where Sally imagines, or audibly at least, an orgasm in a New York deli. The deli now has become famous for that scene. It didn't embarrass Meg Ryan, but it certainly embarrassed everyone else in the restaurant. I wonder, you talk about privacy and sex. We're not private about who we're dating. We're not private about who we're seeing. We're simply private about the sex bit. Why do we distinguish between the two? Why do many of us often show off about our mating companion, our love our love interest at the time, but
Sure.
mostly don't talk about the sex bit.
Because the sex, the benefit, the function of sex when it comes to our species is in monogamous cases the pair bonding. That's got nothing to do with the outside world, right? That's stimulating the chemistry and the attachments between two people. But when it comes to advertising who we're with, that has a lot of societal ramifications. It can be a mark of status. If you've got a very high ranking, famous person that you're dating, that's one thing. If you've got a very good looking, attractive person, that's another. If they're very funny, you could be very proud of them. And there's also the flip side. You'll have people that you date that you might actually feel embarrassed to introduce to your friends because, say, they're not as
That's
attractive.
always been the
Or
case with me, unfortunately.
so yeah, that has a societal connection. So it's fairly clear why we're not private about whom we're seeing in all cases, but that's very different from the actual deed itself.
It's a complicated subject, David, and it's not one that is often talked about so openly. This relationship between our relatives, other species. Darwin, of course, so to speak, discovered that connection in the 19th century. It's perhaps ironic that such a proper Victorian gentleman did this. What does Darwin's treatment of sexuality when it comes to evolution teach us about our history of sex?
Well, I mean, he's most famous for, in his second work, devising the theory of sexual selection. So not everything is survival of the fittest. It's not always about the sharpest fangs or the best adaptations, say camouflage, that allow you to survive. Sometimes traits that are seemingly useless towards survival are selected just because of their ability to attract mates. Whether that be feathers on male peacocks or large, ungainly horns on stags, all of these are examples of the powers of sexual selection. And here's the thing: what for multi-celled species, evolution boils down to is surviving long enough to reproduce. So you need physical traits that allow you to survive, sure, and that comes in many forms. But the end game is to replicate that DNA. And if you're a sexual species, then as opposed to asexual and just cloning yourself, then sex is a big part of that. So it's no surprise that we do see plenty of instances of sexual selection, even in our own lineage.
Is there, well, you talked about status, and most societies are status societies. I think one could argue even in the 21st century ours is as well. It's just a bit more subtle. Can there be, so to speak, anti-sex status? Seems to me that in the expensive universities these days, a lot of the kids are celebrating not having sex, being independent of sex.
hmm
Is there such a thing as an anti-sex status?
I mean, there certainly is, and there's been a number of examples of that sort of
Yeah,
puritanical approach.
monasticism, of course, in the history of a history of Catholicism, nuns, monks.
Yeah. Or if you look at any, let's say Cromwell's reign over England or the Puritan colonies in the early United States, examples of very sex negative societies. And if you think about it for a second, in the sense that, never mind whether sex is sinful or whatever that might be, but if you look at it in the sense that sex is very messy, inevitably, and it's capable of evoking very raw emotions in people and very irrational behavior, you can see how ideologically some people might do the math in their head and think, well, if it causes so much of a mess, then this needs to be very, very tightly constrained in order to maintain the stability of society. Now, whether those mathematics are correct or not is another issue. But you can see how they might conclude, oh, well, we'll just keep this deeply constrained. It's only about procreation. It's not about recreation. And that's the way that we build a strong society without too much hedonism or debauchery. And there's been numerous examples of that, both societies, cultures that are more puritanical than others, and also movements that burn through various cultures and nations. It seems to me that we're currently with our youth going through a very sex negative period, but it isn't entirely universal.
Right. It
In
seems to go
fact,
both ways. You've got the new fashion for polyamory of
mhm,
multiple sex partners, and another fashion for no sex at all. And
yes.
I'm guessing that they're in an odd way connected.
I mean, to a certain extent, if we're just especially if we're talking about young people in the universities and in their 20s, every generation seems to want to reinvent the wheel when it comes their time to venture forth into adulthood. And so that they do things that have been tried uh, a number of times before, but with some variations. So this the rise of both highly sex positive people, people who advocate for polyamory, or are like sex work is real work, and sort of consider it an empowering choice for a young woman to go on OnlyFans. um, those people are butting up against a sort of reaction, because even before the current sex positive movement, we had a prior couple of decades where we were already fairly sex positive, 1990s and early 2000s. And then it seems to me that since in the 2010s, particularly kicking off after 2014, we did see this rise of sex negativity, which was almost compounded by Harvey Weinstein and the Me Too movement. And it seems to put quite a few people
Yeah, and
in
it's
Bill.
also connected with this sort of generally apocalyptic culture or atmosphere, existential when it comes to the environment, not wanting to bring new life into the world. Although I'm not sure that's necessarily connected with being against sex. I mean, you can have a lot of sex and not wanting to have kids, can't you, David?
Oh, I mean, there's plenty of scenarios that have been written about the apocalypse where that's the last thing people do.
I mean, yeah,
And they,
exactly. The Decameron celebrated that more than anything else. I wonder, I find it hard to talk about sex without thinking about Freud and Freud's analysis that when you, and maybe I'm vulgarizing it here, but this is a vulgar kind of conversation, so we can get away with it.
Mhm.
Freud's observation that everything ultimately is about sex. Where is Freud in your shortest history of sex? Is he, so to speak, the climax, or is he a fake climax? Is he the beginning, the middle, or the end of this thing?
Well, I mean, I didn't roll out the red carpet and blow the trumpets for Freud as sort of the end, be all and end all about the theory of sex. I wrote this story
You
more
didn't get the
about.
cigar out.
Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, but the my focus was more on the human behavior in any given period, so widespread population. And when Freud was writing, we were really just on the
That was a
cusp of
Freudian
the.
era, calling him Fried rather than Freud, right?
Oh, was it fried? Okay. In what way?
Well, he's finished if he's fried.
Oh, I see.
Freud is
No,
fried.
no,
Anyway, go on.
no. I've got a great respect for Freud, and I would say that there's a great deal of truth to a lot of his writings about sexuality and human relationships, and how that also relates to our upbringing and our relationships to our parents. But he was writing when we were just on the cusp of immense transformations in human sexuality and how we constitute our own families and societies. A lot of that was kicked off well before, a century earlier, with the start of the Industrial Revolution, where we have this rapid change in our lifestyles and our quality of living, and how we live our lives. And we moved from a phase of, for thousands of years, most of us were farmers, and it made sense to have many children, stable marriages, and clear inheritance in terms of the land, if we had any. And then suddenly, fast forward to say 1920, And for one of the first times in human history, young single women are going out in unprecedented numbers in the West to just live on their own and work, say, at cafes or whatever, and explore before settling down. A practice that became even more common by the 1960s and 70s. Quite the revolutionary change, to which you can lump on the introduction of the pill, abortion, and so forth, that has had a palpable effect on demographic trends and even fertility rates. So that's been my wider focus. Now, the interesting thing about Freud is he's coming at it from a psychological standpoint, but a lot of his theories make sense from an evolutionary standpoint as well. Particularly regarding the mother and father being a potential model for the person that you're going to eventually wind up mating with. When you think in terms of what those characteristics your parents might have had led to the reproduction in you, it must have been to some extent successful. And so, as a human being, observing and capable of certain abstractions and also subconscious calculations in your youth, you might look for similar traits in a potential mate going forward, whether you're aware of it or not. It certainly would be validated by just simple evolution. If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
You mentioned modernity and sex and how it changed everything. I remember there was a wonderful scene in one of Zola's 19th century books about the Industrial Revolution, his social realism, in which he observed that the working class still seemed to enjoy sex. They had sex in the fields. It was cheap or it was free. And the bourgeoisie didn't. One of the marketing observations for your book describes sex as one of life's simplest pleasures. Has it as a pleasure? I mean, we moderns think of it, I guess, or most of us, or many of us think of it as pleasure. Was it always seen as pleasure, or was it simply an obligation, especially in agricultural society, particularly for women?
All right. Well, I mean, for a start, I didn't write that copy, so I'm not sure. I mean, having Phil's,
So you wouldn't describe sex as one of life's. It's probably rather than one of life's simplest pleasures, it should be one of life's most complicated pleasures.
It is highly complex. I spilled about 100,000 words on the topic, but when it comes to so baseline pleasure, a lot of actions that we do. We mentioned eating earlier. We have a dopamine response. With sex, the same thing happened very early in our family tree, but it would the pleasure sensation certainly wasn't as intense neurologically in, say, some of our amphibious ancestors, 400 million years ago, than they are today. But with human beings, certainly in the agrarian era, a lot of sex would have been perfunctory, about having kids, reproduction. But certainly a lot of it would involve pleasure, particularly with men. If you look at the sheer number of prostitutes inhabiting most pre-modern societies, with women it's a bit more complicated, given just it's a different physiology. And if you look at some studies, women are much less likely to be brought to orgasm just from a promiscuous coupling with a stranger. So women, unfortunately, like in a lot of history, get the short end of the stick when it comes to sex and pleasure.
You're saying they don't really like the short end of the stick, right?
There is a bell curve for that, to be sure, that we can discuss. But I mean, even today, we'll still have couples trying for children, and I'm sure there's a brief glimmer of pleasure that might come through the sex when you're trying for a baby, but sometimes it's about having that kid. So we're not so different from traditional societies, say 5 centuries ago, in that respect. And then some sex is wild abandon. I mean, as a species, as an organism, as this thing, we really haven't changed much in terms of our biology or even our basic mental capacities in the last 100, 200,000 years. So, I mean, The only thing that's going to change is our cultural upbringing. And that's going to affect our attitudes towards sex. But a lot to do with human copulation and those people who might go pleasure seeking and those who might treat sex with a sense of duty. The proportions haven't changed too much in the last century.
Well, speaking of pleasure, I don't know if you've seen a new movie out, it's popular in the US, Love Lies Bleeding. It's a rather irreverent lesbian romp, a violent, aggressive, rather out of control lesbian romp. Very amusing. Anyway, there's one scene where the women masturbate publicly together. What about the history? Is masturbation, should it be in the shortest history of sex? Is that part of the narrative, or is it separate?
Masturbation, it does find its way into my book fairly early on, in fact, because even if you just look at mammalian species, it's almost universal among mammals, masturbation of some sort. Some of that seems to be just a way to relieve tension, because all mammals have this immense sex drive, so it's more or less like scratching an itch. Sometimes it's even just to relieve agitation. So you get lions masturbating, elephants masturbating, pretty much across the board, at least with terrestrial mammals. A bit more difficult for a whale to do it, but if you go toward primates, even something as extreme as the bonobos, suddenly masturbation even becomes a part of social interaction, because it's one of the initial ways of a bonobo male to sort of relieve tension around newcomers and strangers. This thing called a bonobo handshake, where a male bonobo will actually thrust their erect penis out at you. And if it's two groups of bonobos that don't know each other meeting in the wild, peace is essentially maintained by the females crossing over to the other group and having sex with the other males. As a human, if you were to work with bonobos, it might be wise just to give the male bonobo a little pat on the erect penis, so he settles down and you can get to whatever.
Sounds a little bit like Donald Trump, except you have to vote for him, right?
I don't know how often Donald Trump thrusts his erect penis at newcomers, but I'll have to look into
Not
that.
as often as he would like these days. I mean, he's got other things to worry about. What about homosexuality? Another enormously controversial subject. Again, David, you don't need me to tell you this, especially these days in the United States. How do you treat it in the shortest history of sex? You said earlier that things haven't changed much. Of course, there was the famous Kinsey report that suggested that somewhere between 10 and 15% of humans are homosexual. Is that, in your view, always been the case?
Kinsey is sort of notorious for some fairly slapdash research methods and inflating his numbers a bit. But if you look at homosexuality in nature, it's been around pretty much since gonochorism in vertebrates has existed. So you can go back over 500 million years. And once we started, once the very earliest vertebrate species no longer were hermaphroditic, but were male-female and just produced egg or sperm. We're still in Cambrian oceans at this point. You already seem to see signs among our common ancestry of bisexuality at that time. And then you have confirmed exclusive homosexual individuals with our last common ancestors with most reptiles. So that brings us up to about 330 million years ago. It's fairly common throughout nature. And the rates of exclusive homosexuality among a species will vary, because, believe it or not, there actually is sometimes a great evolutionary use for it, though the causes may be obscured at times. But what's made it prevail for 500 million years is the fact that no species ever went extinct because a percentage of them were exclusively homosexual or bisexual. You would still have plenty of individuals with the similar genes, similar traits, copulating and procreating. And of course, there's plenty of bisexual individuals. And if you look at human societies in the past, well, several centuries, there's plenty of examples of even exclusively homosexual individuals who will still have children. And that is to say of their own bloodline, as opposed to, say, adoption or something. 10 to 15% Homosexual, it's actually, from the data I've seen, around about 12%, but 12 to 13%, but that's including bisexuality. It's fascinating that a very large proportion of women tend to be bisexual, and that makes up the majority of the 12%. Homosexuality,
Why is it so controversial? Why not everybody, but why are so many people uncomfortable with it?
well, I mean, there's a multitude of reasons for that. I mean,
But
most people.
for scientific, for evolutionary rather than cultural reasons.
Oh, okay. Well, you don't see many. I mean, you see homosexuality in most other species, but you don't exactly see homophobia in most other species. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that most other species aren't capable of abstract thinking, and they're not able to think about the ramifications of who might be interested in who, and if there's a same-sex attracted couple in, say, a primate group. It certainly doesn't factor into anything that impacts their survival. So it's really only with the advent of culture that you see the door open with Homo sapiens for anything that could even constitute homophobia. Now, you don't see a lot of homophobia in past or present hunter-gatherer tribes, and that's how we spent most of our existence since Homo sapiens arose, say, 300,000, 350,000 years ago. Though that may not be because of, let's say, a particularly enlightened or tolerant or progressive culture running through hunter-gatherers, but simply the weight of numbers. If your regular hunter-gatherer group is only a dozen people or so, and exclusively homosexual males are, say, 1.5% of that entire group, male or female, and then exclusively homosexual females are slightly under 1%. You're not going to see that appear in many hunter-gatherer tribes, which is why if you go to Africa today and you were to interview them, well, who here is gay? You're not going to get angry faces in response. You're just going to get confusion, because by pure statistics, they won't have seen it, which is probably why the religions get more likely to be anti-gay once you arrive at agriculture and you have much, much larger populations. But even that varies across cultures. Certainly, in antiquity, you had attitudes that were a little bit more tolerant of homosexuality than what came in sort of the early medieval period onward. And that seems to vary not so much by time period, but just by religion. And so you said not to talk about culture, but I wound up there in the end. It seems to be.
And what about
the deciding
taboos? I mean, the other area, of course, that's enormously controversial is children and sex, and
Yes.
child sexuality and pedophilia.
Yeah.
Has that been a constant in the history of our species, that we've always outlawed sex with children?
No, there's plenty of cultures that, for religious reasons or societal reasons, have permitted it. Most famously, it would be the ancient Greeks taking on young boys as disciples, and part of that relationship between an older and younger man was sex. You see a similar practice in medieval Japan. It pops up a number of times around the globe. Also, what constitutes of age or underage varies wildly. For the majority of cultures, for instance, 13, and particularly for a lot
And
of
childhood's obviously ended a lot
girls.
earlier in an agricultural
Yeah.
society than it does in
But
the modern age.
you certainly, but you do see a lot of counterweight, right? It's not like it was just pedophilia or ephebophilia was just permissible throughout every human culture until modernity, and that largely has to do with the parents and the fact that they don't necessarily want a young, impressionable child to be brought into a sexual relationship before the age of reason, or before they can actually choose or play a role in who pair bonds with them. So, I mean, for hundreds of thousands of years, one of the main ways that different human tribes communicated and traded with each other was through symbolic marriages. So to violate that by taking a child that was too young, the parents and whoever they were allied with in the tribe might have something to say about that, to be sure. Okay, but all of this is apart from, say, the potential trauma or damage you could do to a child by having sex with them. That care and attention to that is definitely something that it came with a more conscientious modernity. Whereas if you look at, I think there's a hunter-gatherer tribe in the Amazon who 12, 13 years old is old enough for a girl to have sex. And part of this particular, I can't remember the name of the tribe, it'll come to me in a second. But part of the wedding ritual is for this young girl to have sex with a sequence of several men over the course of a dinner and an evening. Something that would be absolutely unthinkable to people in the developed world.
Yeah, I think it comes back to
we
your point about us born as blank slates. So the Lockean notion of us taking on the baggage of life introduces the notion of childish innocence, whereas other cultures see us as fully born. So sex acquires different meaning, doesn't it?
Yes, certainly. And someone who's raised in, say, an agrarian society where they may get married at 13 might be indoctrinated in a way that they suffer less trauma than someone who had a 30-year-old man have sex with them at 12 or 13 in the developed world. But here's the thing. If you look at most traditional societies, young sexual relationships were practiced, but they certainly weren't common. Most agrarian societies for 5,000 years had such constraints on people, placed such economic constraints on people that they weren't even ready to get married and start a family until their early to mid 20s. It's not quite as late as moderns, where the median age is something like 28 for women and 30 for men. But it was certainly later in life because you had to economically get things together before you could actually settle down with a woman and well, as a man, to actually prove that you could be a husband and provide for her and her family. The only exception to that is among the elite, where they're already rich, they've already put their stuff together, and so for dynastic reasons, you might arrange a marriage between two people, either two children who are, say, 5 years old, or between an adult and a child who has not yet come of age. Though in many societies, that child will have to wait for a few years.
And then, of course, you have
So it's pedophilia, certainly.
Sorry,
Pardon?
go on.
All right. So pedophilia certainly does appear in pre-modern history as a cultural practice, but it wasn't necessarily universal. So that, to me, indicates quite clearly that, yeah, that there seems to be a discomfort that is more innate to humans about the idea of adults having sex with children, particularly when they're our children.
If we had more time, we could talk harems, but we don't. Let's go from antiquity, traditional agricultural society, to 21st century society and the internet. I know you write in the book about dating apps, new rules for romance in our networked age. Some people seem to think that the internet, in fact, someone wrote a book about it, the way in which the internet has ruined sex, ubiquitous pornography, too easy access to people of the other sex. What's your take on whether or not the internet changes anything when it comes to the history of sex?
Well, the dating app, as it's currently constituted, is the kiss of death for male reproductive success. So I guess we could start there. The
Wow, that's pretty
fact
dramatic.
is,
Sorry, go on, David.
there was connection lost. I think you're back. What did you say?
Yeah, well, you were talking, and maybe there was the internet getting its own back on us. You talked about the internet being the kiss of death for male reproductive, right?
Reproductive success. Yes. The app specifically. Yes. though you could also apply it to something like Instagram. And that just has to do with the method of most seductions between men and women, how they tend to naturally occur, and have done so for thousands of years. So all of that's been thrown overboard because suddenly you're not approaching someone that, as a man, you're not approaching a woman that your family has introduced you to, or that you met at work, or you picked up in a bar, where you're able to demonstrate a sense of humor, a sense of confidence, and a number of other things besides just physicality or the amount of money in your wallet that might signal that you'd make a good partner. There's a whole constellations of things, constellation of things when it comes to women selecting partners. And if you look at just the app, suddenly you've got a bunch of men, most of whom are not considered attractive by women just physically, who have to get all of that work done in the space of a few pictures and a couple of lines bios, um, that half of the girls might not even read when they're swiping. So there's a lot less success for men on these apps, a lot less potential unless they're very good looking or they're somehow able to signal that they've got
So it's
a
like
fascinating
everything
life.
else on the internet. It's a winner take all economy.
Yes. And so what happens is, one, uh, men swipe exponentially more on these apps. They swipe right exponentially more on these apps than women do. With men, it's something like 50% of the time they'll swipe right. Women, it's depending on what study you look at, it's between 5 and 15%. And most of the time, it's the same men because some men photograph well, and most of us don't. And that's actually a function of our evolutionary past as well, going back tens of millions of years as primates. And so, because we've eliminated that ability to actually interact in person, a lot of the busy work that men used to do to get a woman's attention can no longer be performed, certainly not with the same degree of efficacy. The internet causes that sort of problem, but it also causes the problem where, at the other end of the spectrum, women are getting all this attention, and so they're able to be much more selective. But if you're all competing for the same men, then you're going to see the rise, and indeed we do, of certain men juggling women and men opting towards situationships and not committing. And so you wind up with an interesting dynamic where men are disadvantaged at the beginning of this process. And then after a decade of this, when women are approaching, say, 35, 40, suddenly they start to suffer disadvantages because they have essentially, you've had 100% of women chasing a smaller percentage of men and getting left out. And of course, we're not a species that behaves like gorillas. We don't have harems. We're not polygynous in the main. Culturally, can we be, but it's not instinctual. And so most men in modern society aren't going to construct a harem of women, who swiped them on Twitter, and most women wouldn't consent to being in such a setup. So what you wind up with is just an aborted new experiment in terms of coupling for both men and women across entire cultures. And it seems to show, both in terms of the statistics and how many people are single and sexless, both in men and women these days, and also just the expression of mounting dissatisfaction with the dating scene, which is strange. But I mean, the biggest piece of advice I could give to anyone in that regard is you need to throw away the internet and the apps when it comes to your love life and go out in public and meet people more. It's an interesting thing where men under 30, in a study that was conducted, I think, about a year ago, it was reported that 69% of them had either not approached a woman in the last year or had never approached a woman in public to try to pick her up. And then in the same study, they interviewed women and found that roughly 75% of them wish they were approached in public more, because what's happening is we've all just fallen back and completely disincentivized people to overcome that initial anxiety that comes with approaching a stranger with romantic intentions in public.
I have to ask you this, David. Some people are going to be listening, some people watching. The connection isn't great, so the audio is a bit dodgy. But anyone watching will note your very, very distinctive and distinguished mustache, which you're stroking a lot of the time while we speak. Do we fashion ourselves sexually? I mean, not necessarily you, but do men, for example, grow mustaches for sexual reasons?
I mean, any kind of facial hair across cultures is considered a sign of virility. Um,
So
so
you
if you
must be
want,
very virile with that big mustache.
well, if you want to telegraph, that's one use of the mustache. Yes. Others, there are others who might want to telegraph a more clean-cut baby face thing, because there's
That's
certainly
me.
certain women who find clean shaven much more attractive, particularly if you're looking at younger people going nuts over boy band stars. I'm pretty sure Bieber wouldn't have made it big in 2010 if he had a giant, ridiculous mustache like mine. As for whether this mustache of mine was grown particularly to get the babes, I'm afraid I have to disappoint you. It started with me just seeing how big I could grow it. I trimmed it recently, so it's not as majestic as it
So
could
you're
be.
not the Burt Reynolds of academic historians.
Well, I wouldn't shy away from people giving me that title, but time will tell.
Well, you can have the title. Let's end with technology. A couple of questions which are also enormously controversial. The issue of trans, it divides people. It makes some people incredibly angry, others very perplexed. Do you address this in the shortest history of sex? What happens if you choose to use technology to change your gender? Does that affect sex or not?
Well, when it comes to transgenderism and the phenomenon of dysphoria, I tried to trace it back as far as I could in our evolutionary lineage. Um, and so I do address where there is marked evidence of it. Certainly, the conceptions of gender, both a binary or otherwise, has changed across cultures as well. There's sometimes a little bit too much credit given to hunter-gatherer societies, because they tend to have uh, uh, a concept known as third gender, but that does not apply just to trans people. That applies to a goodly 10% of the population. Gay, lesbian, but even straight, effeminate, and straight masculine women can wind up classified in such cultures in the third gender. So it's very different. And again, you might see evidence, in Mesopotamian societies of transgenderism. There's a whole history. And there's even a potential biological legacy to that. In terms of the use of technology to change your gender identity, I mean, the first and foremost concern, if we're dealing with it as a medical treatment or psychological treatment, is does it reduce the incidence of suicidal ideation and actual suicides? Because dysphoria has one of the biggest suicide rates of anything out there. So, I mean, if you feel that you're born inside the wrong body and you want to kill yourself, the um, if the way forward is to change the outward expression of your gender to match more than what you feel it is inside, then fine. But there is a great deal of controversy and debate about the efficacy of whether sex change or gender affirming treatments actually do reduce suicide rates, because the suicide rates for many post-op people is also quite alarming. So it depends on what we're trying to adjust here. As for people changing their secondary sex characteristics for reasons that have nothing to do with psychology but are just cultural, it depends on the logic of what we're doing here. And that would be case by case. Certainly, I wouldn't advise going through such an expensive, painful process on a whim or to get attention on social media.
Well, finally, and some people get attention willingly, others less willingly. Finally, last but not least, David, we had a show with a science writer, Eve Herold, who's written about the world of robots, our AI age, and we asked whether you should have sex with your robot. Sounds rather vulgar and perhaps childish, but it's becoming increasingly a reality. You write in the book about sex bots. How does AI change all this? Smart machines. Can we have sex with robots?
Well, I mean, this is the thing: is if you can contemplate just the physical act of sex, if you have a fancy, realistic-looking device, functionally, if it's just a device, it's masturbatory. It's very little different. It's more expensive, but it's very little different from using your hands or a dildo or a pocket pussy or whatever it is you might employ. What's interesting about AI is it fulfills that entire other side, or can fulfill the entire other side of sex, which is not about the physical, but about the companionship. So I have looked over several, boyfriend girlfriend bots and seen how effective they are. And there's hiccups and pitfalls, but as a replacement for companionship, I think that if our society gets increasingly isolated, that might catch on and be a major industry. Now, whether people want to spend $10,000 on a hyper realistic man or woman, that's something else. But I wouldn't necessarily even recommend such behaviors because it seems to be a disturbing trend, how sort of isolated and fragmented we're getting from one another. But certainly, if that process is inevitable, then I could see AI companionship becoming an increasingly common coping mechanism.
So it's okay for me after this interview, David, to go and have sex with my robot.
It's okay for you to do whatever it is you want, so long as you're not in violation of the law or someone else's physical space or rights. Go for it.